Hey pilots, what's up? Welcome to another brand new video. Today I'm going to explain to you the role-based access control feature and how you can use it. So let's get started. Alright, so before we dive into the actual role-based access feature, we need to understand some terminologies. First, there is user. So what is a user? A user is a person that has the access to log into your workspace and perform actions based on the permissions you have given to that user. You can have two types of user, a client and a team member. So a user is exactly what is said here. It is a person that you add in your workspace who can actually log in and view the things that is inside of your workspace and do certain things based on the permissions that you have given them. So you can have two types of user. There's client and team member. So let me explain this. A team member is a kind of user that you're going to add to help you in doing stuff so like creating contacts, sending messages, creating templates, etc. On the other hand, a client is a special kind of user. So if you create a workspace, if you create a partner workspace, we're going to come into that later on, but if you create a workspace for a client, you would need to add a client in that workspace. And this client can do all the things inside of that workspace. So you're going to understand this more when we come into the workspace section, but I think you get the idea of the user right here. All right. So then we have the permission. What is a permission? A permission is a allowance to perform a certain action. For example, the user john@email.com has the permission to create a contact. Then the user john@email.com can create a contact. So a permission is a permission. You give a permission to create a contact to a user. That user can then create a contact. So what is a role here? Well, you can think of a role as a group of permissions. So you can attach many permissions, for example, creating contact, viewing contacts, creating contact groups. All these permissions you can attach to a role. And then you can assign this role to a user. So the user will have all the permissions that is inside of this role. So let me just show you a quick little graph. So for example, this is your team member. This is role, and these are the permissions. So these three permissions are actually assigned or attached to this role, and then this role is actually assigned to this team member. Now, this team member has all these three permissions through this role. If you assign this role to this team member will then have all these permissions. If you remove this role from this team member will lose all the permissions that is here or that is assigned to this role. So I think that is clear. All right, now let's come to the workspaces. What is a workspace? A workspace is a resource that contains all of the other resources like contacts, contact groups, templates, campaigns, etc. You can have one or multiple workspaces based on your subscription. There are two types of workspaces, internal and partner. So you can think of a workspace as a box, and inside of this box, there's contacts, contact groups, contact fields, your users, and all of those things. And you can create multiple boxes which are isolated and they have their own resources. Meaning, if you have two workspaces, if the first workspace has 3 contacts, you won't see those 3 contacts on the second workspace or the second box because they are isolated. So you can create workspaces like these or boxes like these, and inside of each boxes, you have all these resources like contacts, contact groups, templates, etc. You can connect us. And also there's one thing to note, you can connect a single channel or a single number inside of a single box. So every box has only one channel connection ability. And you have two kinds of workspaces. So you have internal workspace and you have a partner workspace. So what is an internal workspace? Well, internal workspaces are workspaces that you would create for your own use. For example, for your marketing, for your customers, for providing customer support, you're going to create an internal workspace. These internal workspaces has all the permissions that exist. So it has all the permissions, and you would create these internal workspaces for your own use. On the other hand, the partner workspaces are for your clients. So if you have sold your workspaces to your clients, for example, client John, client Max, you would create partner workspaces for them. Now about the workspace having permissions, that I'm going to explain later in this video. But for now, just try to understand this internal and partner workspace. I think it is clear that you're going to create internal workspaces for your own use and partner workspaces for your client. All right, so let's talk about the role-based access feature. What is the role-based access feature? Well, it's very simple. You just assign permissions to a user, and that user can then perform actions based on that permission. So here's a little graph to explain better. So let's say this is your team member, and you have given this permission to this team member. So this team member can use this permission to perform this action. So it can perform the action if it has the permission. So if this team member has this permission, he'll be able to perform this action. So that is actually the whole idea of a permission or a role-based access feature. Here, role-based meaning you assign roles to this team member. So for example, you have a role that has many permissions and you assign that role to this team member, and then that team member will have all the permissions and can perform those actions based on those permissions. That is the basic idea of a role-based access feature. And now let's dive into to whom you can actually assign these permissions to. So if you look here, we can assign the permissions to only a partner workspace and a team member. Now you might ask, what about the internal workspaces? What about the clients? Can I not control the permissions of them? Well, you really don't need to do that. I'm going to come into that later, but first I want to clear something about assigning permissions to the partner workspace. So let's go a bit down here, and you can see we have a little graph here. So this box is a partner workspace, and inside of this workspace we have a client and a team member. And if you look on the right side, you can see there are 3 permissions, concepts of create, update, and delete, and we're assigning these 3 permissions to this partner workspace. Also, we have another permission here, and this is not assigned to this workspace. Now, a client or a team member cannot perform an action if that action's permission is not given to their workspace. Meaning, this team member or this client cannot create a template because this creating template permission is not assigned to their workspace, which is this partner workspace. But they can actually create a contact, update a contact, and delete a contact because these permissions are actually assigned to their workspace. I hope that is clear. And there is one more thing to it. A client can create a contact or update a contact or delete a contact if the permission is in their workspace, which is the partner workspace. But a team member yet cannot create a contact or update a contact or delete a contact, although the permissions are in their workspace. Because you need to give this team member permissions of these things as well. So you need to give these permissions to the workspace of the team member as well as to the team member itself. So the team member will have these permissions. So for example, these permissions, and only then this team member will be able to perform these actions. So it's kind of like this. You have a workspace and you only want to allow some features to be able to be accessed by this workspace. So you're gonna the features are basically the permissions. So you give the feature or permission to create a contact, update a contact, or delete a contact to this workspace, and inside of this workspace, anybody like the client or the team member will only be able to do things based on the permissions that is assigned to their workspace. And the client, by default, will be able to do everything that the workspace has permissions of. So you do not need to separately add permissions to the client like we have did to the team member. The team member needs specific permissions to itself. Even though the permissions are assigned to its workspace, it still needs the permissions directly assigned to it, and the client does not need it because the client will be able to do everything that is allowed to this workspace, meaning these permissions assigned to this workspaces, so the client can do all of these things, but the team member needs permissions to do these things as well. All right, now let's talk about the internal workspace. So the internal workspace by default has all the permissions, and you cannot even update the internal workspace's permissions. So the internal workspace that you create for your own use will have all the permissions assigned to it by default. So you do not actually need to assign the permissions separately to these workspaces. Now, the internal workspace cannot actually have a client because it is for your own use. So you would add team members for in your internal workspaces. And these team members need permissions to be directly assigned to them. So the team member, whether in a partner workspace or an internal workspace, the permissions need to be directly assigned to the team member in order for that team member to perform actions. And one more thing, in the partner workspace, you can only assign team members those permissions that are inside the partner that are inside of its workspace, which is the partner workspace. So, for example, to this team member, you can assign context create permissions because it is in the workspace as well. The workspace also has this permission. You can assign this one to because these all permissions are also assigned in this partner workspace. But because the templates.create permission is not assigned to this partner workspace, you cannot assign this permission to this team member. In order to add this permission to this team member, first you need to add this permission to the partner workspace, then add this permission to the team member itself. So remember I told you about the permissions can be assigned only to a partner workspace and a team member workspace. So let's just revise this thing because we have already talked about it. So this is a partner workspace. So in a partner workspace, you can assign permissions. And in an internal workspace, you cannot assign permissions because the internal workspace has all the permissions by default. You do not need to assign any permission to the internal workspace. So that is why you do not need to assign any permissions to an internal workspace, but you need to assign permissions to a partner workspace to tell the partner workspace what are the things that you can actually do. Then we had the question of why can't we control the permissions of a client? Well, if you think carefully, a client can actually perform all the actions of this partner workspace because it is a client. And so, for example, if the partner workspace has these permissions, the client will have these permissions. If the partner workspace has templates or create permission, the client will have templates or create permissions. So we do not need to separately handle the client permissions. What we can just do if we want to change the permissions of a client, we just change the permission of the partner workspace. So for example, we don't want the client to be able to update the context. So we're just going to remove the update contact permission from the workspace itself. So the client won't be able to do it as well. So that is why we don't need to manage the client permissions as well, because changing the partner workspace permissions is actually the same thing as updating the client permissions. So we don't need to handle the permissions of a client, but we would need to handle the permissions of a team member because the team member needs the permissions directly assigned to it, although the workspace might have those permissions. The reason for that is you would want to control the permissions of a team member. A client can also control the permissions of a team member. You would not always want the team member to perform all the permissions that is inside of the workspace. It is the team member. So you can choose to give the permissions, whichever permission you want, or the client can also give permissions to the team member of its workspace and control the limitations of that team member. So I think that is clear. I think the whole idea of this role-based access feature is clear. Now let's dive into the real action. So I'm going to go to Lancepilot and I'm going to actually show you how you can assign permissions, create roles, and manage the whole role-based access feature. All right, so now I'm going to show you the whole role-based access feature in action. So let's go to the workspaces section from here. I have logged into my account in Lancepilot, and from there I'm going to the workspaces section. As you can see, I have many workspaces. So you can also see there are two types of workspaces, internal and partner. Using the create button, I can create another workspace. Just for testing purposes, I can just say a new test workspace, and I'm going to create a partner workspace here. When I click on create new workspace, as you can see, a new workspace has been created, and it is a partner type. Now, the partner workspaces are for a client, remember, and the internal workspaces are for your own use. So let's go to the partner. Okay, before going to the partner workspace, I want to show you this. So here is an option called the roles and permission. I'm on an internal workspace, and if I go to the roles and permission section, I can see all the roles of this workspace. Now there is no roles here, so I'm going to create one, and I'm going to name it manager, and I'm going to create a role. As you can see, we have a manager role here, and if I click on this three-dot icon and go to permissions, I can see all the permissions that are given to this manager role. I can, let's just give it some permissions of the contact. So all the permissions of the contact. If I update the permission, now this role has all those context permissions that I just gave to this role. Now I can assign this manager role to a user. So if I come here and go to the users section, so here are all the users of my internal main workspace. I can create a team member or a user. And by the way, in an internal workspace, you cannot create a client. So all these users that you see are actually team members. So I can create a new one. I'm not going to do that because I already have a team member and I want to assign that role to this team member. So if I just click on the roles, I can add this manager role and update the roles. I can add multiple roles to the same user, and I can also directly give permissions to this user by going to the permissions section. So as you can see, I have given many permissions to this team member, and this team member can perform all the actions that I have selected here. One more thing to note here is if a team member has a permission through a role or a direct permission, then the team member will be able to perform that action. If a team member has a permission directly but not in the role, but not through a role, the user will still be able to do it. If the team member has a permission through a role but not directly from the permission sections, the user will still be able to do it. In order to disable a feature or a permission for a specific team member, you have to make sure it does not have any role that has that permission, or it does not have direct permissions from the permissions section of that user. I hope that is clear. All right, now let's talk about the partner workspaces. So I'm going to switch to a partner workspace, and after switching to a partner workspace, you can find another option called the workspace permissions. If you click on this option, from here, you can manage all the permissions of this partner workspace. So remember, I showed you a graph saying permissions can be assigned to a partner workspace. So let me just show it to you. So this is a graph. So this partner workspace can have permissions. We can attach permissions to this partner workspace. So where do we do it from? The answer is from this section. You go to a partner workspace, go to the workspace permissions section, and from here you can manage the partner workspace permissions. Now, if you go to the roles and permissions section, you can see the roles and permissions are empty because we have not created any role on this workspace. The manager role is actually in our internal workspace, but for this workspace, we have not created any role. That's why there is no role here. So we can also create a role here. I'm going to call it manager again, and we have a role here. We can manage the permissions from here, same as the internal workspace's roles. We can also go to the users section and create a team member and assign the roles to this user. Now there's one different thing here than the internal workspace is the client users. So in an internal workspace, you cannot create a client, but in a partner workspace, you can create a client. So if I click on create and I create a client, and then I need to check this option called client and create a new user. So now I have a client in this partner workspace, and I cannot actually manage the permissions of this client. The reason is the client has all the permissions of its workspace, in this case, this workspace. So where are the permissions of this workspace? Here on the workspace permissions section. So if you go here, whatever permission we set here and click the update permissions button, all of these permissions of this workspace will automatically be assigned to the client of the workspace. But if we create a team member, create a new user, now I have a team member in this workspace. Now, if I click on these three dot icons, you can see I have the permissions and roles option here for managing a team member's permission or roles. But if I click three dots here on the client, I cannot see the roles and permissions option because we do not need to manage the roles and permissions of a client. The client automatically has all the permissions of its workspace, in this case, this workspace. So I hope that is clear. Now, there's another issue here, and that is every single time creating a partner workspace and setting their permissions again and again is a pain. And you would want to many times just assign the same permissions to many partner workspaces. So to solve that issue, what you can do is come here on the workspaces section, then go to partner permissions. And here you can select the default partner workspaces permissions, meaning any permissions you select here and update the permissions will automatically be assigned to a partner workspace when you create it. So for example, I have selected all of these permissions. I have updated the permissions. If I go to the workspaces section, create a new partner workspace called test partner and create. Now, if I see the permissions of this workspace, I need to switch to it. Then if I go to the workspace permissions, as you can see, the default permissions are automatically assigned to this partner workspace when I create it. And that is actually how you manage all the permissions and roles of your workspaces. I hope there is no confusion and you'll be able to manage your permissions and roles nicely by watching this video.